The sound of the Duke of Ravenshire's fall still haunted London, though it had occurred more than a year prior. Whispers claimed the accident had been grievous, that his legs had buckled beneath him upon the back of his magnificent stallion, leaving him broken and confined to a life of shame. Some said the fall was punishment for pride, others whispered it was mercy turned cruel. No matter the tale, the effect was the same. The Duke became a ghost among the living, a recluse whose name carried pity and scandal in equal measure. The first time Lady Eliza Hawthorne heard of him, the story reached her ears as a cruel jest, told in the clipped, perfumed tones of women who thrived on the misfortune of others. She had been 13 at the time, seated beside her mother at a midsummer fete, and the words had struck her like ice water. The poor Duke, doomed to a life in a chair, robbed of all but his bitter pride. Even then, her heart had ached for him, though she did not know why. Now, in the winter of 1815, London's season blazed with gold and crystal, every ballroom echoing with laughter, music, and the rustle of silks. Yet, beneath the gaiety, a current of cruelty pulsed, unseen but unmistakable. In the great hall of the Duke's rivals, mirrors reflected chandeliers that glittered like captured stars, but no star shone brighter than the gossip that filled the room. And here, in the midst of powdered hair and delicate fans, Eliza moved like a shadow of conscience, quietly observing the faces of women who considered charm and vanity interchangeable, and men whose amusement required another's humiliation. She was not beautiful in a way that made society swoon, nor possessed of wit so sharp it cut rivals down. She was gentle, thoughtful, careful, and in a world that rewarded spectacle and cunning, such qualities were both a rarity and a liability. It was at a ball in Grosvenor Square that the Duke of Ravenshire appeared, or rather, was brought forth by the careful hands of fate. He did not glide into the room with the ease of other men, nor did he command attention with a voice trained to charm the aristocracy. He came instead with measured steps, cane in hand, shoulders slightly bowed as if carrying a weight the world could never understand. Even the candles seemed to dim in his presence, the flickering light bending toward pity. The assembled company regarded him with polite avoidance, a mixture of curiosity and disdain, as if his very existence reminded them that fortune and title could be fragile. Eliza noticed him before most did. She saw the fine line of his jaw, the solemn arch of his brow, the faint tremor of his hands, a trembling that suggested pain or fear, she could not tell which. She observed the way his eyes swept the room, alert yet cautious, as if measuring which heart might harbor sympathy. And perhaps it was sympathy that drew her near, a tender instinct she could neither name nor resist. While the others laughed at the whispers of his injury, she felt a stirring of compassion that bordered on reverence. She knew that pity alone was a poor foundation for friendship, yet it moved her to act where others hesitated. The first encounter came during the minuet, when a particularly cruel viscount, newly arrived and eager to assert his wit, whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Do you think the Duke can stand for the dance, or must we assist him with a chair?" A ripple of laughter followed, light and hollow. Eliza's cheeks burned not with vanity, but with indignation. She could not abide such cruelty, not against a man whose only crime was misfortune. Without thought of her own standing, she approached the Duke, offering her hand with a clarity of purpose that silenced the immediate circle. "Would you honor me with this dance, your Grace?" she asked, her voice steady, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. The question, simple in construction, carried with it an audacity born of innocence and conviction. The room stilled, the music tapering into background hums as the Duke regarded her, startled, suspicion clouding the dark depth of his eyes. He did not answer immediately, he merely regarded her, as if weighing her intent, and the gesture of his slight bow seemed both cautious and impossibly dignified. He began, and then faltered, an uncertainty rare for a man whose title alone should have commanded authority. "You would," he paused, the tremor in his voice betraying a vulnerability no one else had glimpsed. "You would offer me a dance of your own choosing?" Eliza inclined her head once, a gesture both courteous and resolute. "Indeed, my lord. I fear the company's mirth is less generous than the music. It would be my pleasure to dance, unburdened by their cruelty." A slow, almost imperceptible transformation passed over him. His shoulders straightened, though only a fraction, and the faintest of smiles touched his lips. Perhaps it was astonishment, or the dawning recognition that someone had seen him not as a spectacle of misfortune, but as a man. He took her hand, the contact electric yet tender, and together they moved into the center of the hall. The candles flickered with a new energy, reflecting off her modest gown, the soft folds of ivory and sapphire, and his own austere attire of deep black trimmed with silver. They moved in rhythm, not merely to the music, but to a delicate accord of understanding that passed unspoken between them. Whispers continued, but their edge dulled. Some admired her courage, others sneered at what they considered folly. Eliza did not notice. Her heart, fragile but stubborn, beat in careful alignment with his, and for the first time, she glimpsed a man who existed beyond rumor and pity. He did not speak again during the dance, yet every glance, every tilt of his head, carried meaning she felt rather than heard. The ballroom, alive with judgment, had become a private chamber of revelation. When the final notes of the minuet faded, he inclined his head once more, bowing with a gravity that carried centuries of unspoken sorrow. "Lady Eliza," he murmured, barely above the hum of conversation, "you have shown kindness where none was expected. That shall not be forgotten." Her heart fluttered, though she fought to maintain composure. The moment held a weight neither fully understood, a beginning unmarked by ceremony, yet more significant than any ball or banquet. The murmurs resumed, softer now, curiosity tinged with respect, but she remained focused on the man before her. The room's glittering splendor seemed to dim, leaving only two figures tethered by a fragile understanding and the unspoken promise that something profound had begun to unfold. As the Duke returned to his seat, aided subtly by the tilt of his cane, he glanced once over his shoulder. Their eyes met, a quiet acknowledgement, a shared secret in a room alive with scrutiny. Somewhere deep within, Eliza felt a stirring that neither pity nor propriety could contain. In that instant, she understood that the greatest trial of her compassion would soon arrive, though she could not yet imagine the full measure of what it demanded. And as the music resumed, louder now, more confident, she felt the weight of a question she could not yet ask: could a heart built on pity ever find its own courage, and would that courage be enough to endure the storms that waited beyond the ballroom doors? The carriage arrived at the Hawthorne estate just as the first thin frost kissed the garden hedges, a black coach bearing the Duke of Ravenshire's crest and the weight of inevitability. It thundered along the cobbled drive, rattling in a manner that seemed to echo the whispers already alive in London. The city spoke of folly, of a girl who dared pity a man others deemed broken. Eliza had been standing at the drawing-room window, her gloved hands pressed to the cold glass, when the footman announced the arrival of a messenger bearing an envelope sealed with black wax, heavy with the Ravenshire sigil. The trembling of her fingers as she took it was not from fear alone, but from a strange premonition, a sense that the world she knew, polite and measured though it was, would soon fracture into something far more intricate, far more dangerous to the heart. She opened the letter with a care born of both reverence and dread. The Duke's hand was unmistakable, his elegant script flowing like liquid shadow across the page. "Lady Eliza Hawthorne, it is my hope that you will consider the honor I seek to bestow upon you. I request your hand in marriage, not as a demand of rank, but as a sincere wish for companionship that transcends the pity of the tongue. Your kindness has been observed, and it is my belief that your heart is the only one capable of seeing me beyond my misfortune." The words, polite yet laden with a subtle weight, made her chest tighten. It was no ordinary proposal, nor the shallow flirtation of a man seeking title or inheritance. This was a proposition that demanded courage, empathy, and a willingness to step beyond the boundaries of societal expectation. Her mother hovered nearby, hand pressed to her stern cheek, eyes narrowing at the sight of the letter. "Eliza," she whispered, voice trembling between indignation and fear, "the scandal this will cause. A crippled duke? You, my dear, would be mocked for a lifetime. Do you comprehend the audacity of such a choice?" Eliza felt the familiar tug of propriety, the invisible strings of family expectation, yet she did not falter. She folded the letter carefully and placed it to her breast, as though by doing so she might steady the fluttering of her own heart. "Mother," she said softly, "perhaps it is not audacity to accept what few have dared. Perhaps it is courage. And perhaps it is time I do what is right for another, not merely for myself or for society's approval." In the days that followed, London seethed with murmurs that slid like knives through gilded parlors. Mothers warned daughters of the foolish mercy of Lady Eliza, men speculated on whether the Duke would survive the union without further humiliation. Invitations arrived at Ravenshire Manor not as celebrations, but as cautious inquiries: would she truly marry the man who could not walk unaided, whose fortune and power seemed diminished by accident and rumor alike? Yet amid the gossip, Eliza found herself strangely resolute. The act of offering her compassion, of stepping willingly into a world where pity and honor were dangerously entwined, made her feel alive in a way that no ballroom or gown had ever accomplished. The wedding day arrived in a hush of frost and fog, the estate draped in heavy curtains of grey mist that seemed to veil the approaching scandal. Only a select few guests attended, men and women whose curiosity outweighed either kindness or discretion. Eliza descended the grand staircase in a gown of muted ivory, trimmed with silver thread, the fabric whispering softly with each careful step. Her mother's eyes glistened, caught between pride and apprehension, while her father's hand lingered briefly on hers, offering the smallest reassurance before retreating into the shadows of his reserved demeanor. The Duke awaited at the foot of the stairs, cane in hand, his posture rigid, shoulders squared, eyes shadowed with the gravity of a man accustomed to solitude. As she approached, the hall seemed to contract, the air charged with expectation. Their vows were exchanged in measured tones, formal and precise, yet beneath each word ran a current of unspoken emotion. "I take thee," the Duke intoned, voice low and tremulous, "not for pity, nor for fortune, but for the measure of your heart which I have seen and honored above all else." Eliza's own words echoed in kind, a careful articulation of promise and principle. "I accept you, my lord, not for what the world sees, nor for what it whispers, but for the truth I discern in you, which no rumor can touch." The murmurs of the guests were subdued, replaced by a tense reverence, as if the ceremony itself had suspended judgment in a fragile bubble of sincerity. Yet even as the vows concluded, a subtle dissonance stirred. Eliza noticed the Duke's hand, so slight upon his cane, bore the faint tremor of strength restrained, not absent. His eyes, which rarely met hers fully, flickered with moments of clarity that seemed incongruous with the image of a man truly incapacitated. The staff, silent and deferential, exchanged furtive glances when their backs were turned. And when the guests departed, leaving only shadows and candlelight to settle upon the halls, a subtle shift occurred. The Duke, alone with Eliza, moved not as a man broken, but with a restraint that suggested something deliberately withheld. He presented her with a small silver locket, delicate and ornate, engraved with the Ravenshire crest. Inside rested a single pressed violet, its petals faded yet intact, preserved like a memory of gentleness. "For remembrance," he murmured, "that in the midst of pity, there may exist something worthy of honor and care." Eliza held the locket as one might cradle a fragile promise, sensing that within it lay not merely sentiment, but the first thread of a bond neither of them yet fully understood. Even that evening, as the wind rattled the manor's leaded windows and frost gathered along the stone sills, she noticed discrepancies in the Duke's comportment. Footfalls echoed with more certainty than a cripple's should allow. Doors opened with subtle ease, hands grasped banisters with deliberate strength. And when he moved through the dimly lit corridors, aided by no one but his own will, a shadow of something forbidden and unspoken brushed against her perception. It was a hint of a truth unspoken, an enigma wrapped in propriety, that suggested the man she had married was both more and less than he appeared. The guests had departed, the house was quiet except for the soft crackle of firelight and the low murmur of the wind outside. Eliza's heart thrummed in her chest with a mixture of pride and apprehension, for though she had acted from compassion, she now recognized that the path she had chosen was fraught with peril beyond societal judgment. Every glance, every gesture of the Duke seemed to test her understanding, each movement a question to which she did not yet have an answer. And as she retired to her chambers, the silver locket warm against her palm, she could not shake the sense that the life she had stepped into would demand of her more than courage alone. It would demand insight, patience, and a capacity to see beneath the surface where few dared to look. That night, as the manor slept beneath its blanket of frost and fog, she caught a glimpse of the Duke in the hallway, standing not with the careful gait of one crippled, but with a quiet, controlled strength that defied rumor and expectation. He did not speak, but the look in his eyes was enough, an unvoiced acknowledgment that the story London had whispered was not the whole truth. A question hung between them in the still air, delicate and perilous. Could compassion alone suffice when the heart's deepest secrets were yet concealed? The storm came without warning, ripping through the countryside with a fury that seemed to echo the tension growing within Ravenshire Manor. Lightning tore across the sky, illuminating the darkened halls in brief, jagged flashes, while the wind rattled windowpanes and scattered leaves like shivering shadows across the grounds. It was on such a night that Eliza found herself wandering the West Wing, heart heavy with questions she had long feared to ask. The house, usually silent save for the quiet obedience of staff, felt alive with secrets, each door and corridor bearing the weight of whispered truths yet unspoken. She could no longer ignore the small inconsistencies, the subtle dissonances that had shadowed every movement of the Duke since their marriage. And so she walked, hand pressed lightly to the banister, drawn toward the private study, toward the man who had captivated her heart without her consent. She found him seated by the window, cane discarded and forgotten on the floor, staring into the storm as though it were a confidant rather than a threat. The firelight flickered across his features, revealing a face carved by both suffering and restraint, and for the first time, she saw the depth of loneliness that had become his companion. "You wander the halls at such an hour," he said without turning, voice low and cautious, yet threaded with an intimacy that unsettled her more than the wind outside. "Surely even courage has its limits, Lady Eliza." "I could ask the same of you," she replied, stepping closer, her skirts whispering softly against the polished floorboards. "For all the talk of injury and misfortune, you move with more purpose than a man confined to weakness. I do not understand, and I cannot bear the uncertainty any longer." Her words, though gentle, carried the weight of frustration and longing, the tension of a heart suspended between faith and doubt. At last, he turned, the storm's reflection dancing in his dark eyes. Then it is time, is it not? Time to unravel what has remained hidden for too long, even from those who claim to see me. The silence that followed was heavier than the rain, each droplet against the window sounding like a hammer striking the walls of their restraint. He took a deep breath, as if gathering fragments of courage from some secret well, and began with a voice that trembled between confession and relief. I am not broken, Lady Eliza. The words, simple yet impossible, fell like a chisel against the walls she had built around pity and devotion. The accident, the rumors, the whispers, all of it was a carefully maintained illusion. I remained as they believed me to be, not because I was injured, but because I wished to see who would look beyond what was seen, who would offer kindness without reward, who would love a man for the soul beneath the title. He paused, searching her face for a reaction that he had long feared might never come. All others fled when my fortune or health faltered. All others loved the trappings, the illusion. You have seen me without pretense, and yet you did not recoil. Eliza's breath caught, a mixture of shock, anger, and an impossible tenderness. You deceived me, she said, voice trembling but firm, with lies dressed as truth. How am I to trust that any word, any gesture, any vow you offer now is real? Her hands shook, the firelight reflecting in her eyes as the storm outside mirrored the tempest within her heart. She had married him out of compassion, yes, but also out of a desire to act rightly in a world that often rewarded cruelty over virtue. And now that foundation, the one she had clung to with courage and hope, felt suddenly fragile and uncertain. He rose, stepping closer, the firelight casting long shadows that stretched toward her like fingers of explanation. I deceived no one but myself, he murmured, the weight of his confession pressing against the silence. I deceived my own heart, fearing it would never be known, never cherished for what it truly is. You are not deceived, Eliza, for you have seen me as I have wished to be seen, a man, whole in spirit, yearning for a companion who values what cannot be bought, cannot be borrowed by status or wealth. His hand reached for hers, tentative yet insistent, bridging the chasm wrought by mistrust and the remnants of societal expectation. She allowed him to take it, though her heart quaked with uncertainty. The warmth of his palm, firm yet gentle, spoke in ways words could not capture. She saw then the vulnerability behind the stoicism, the lonely vigilance that had become his armor, and the immense courage required not merely to survive the whispers of London, but to confess the truth to the woman who had dared to pity him. Tears pricked her eyes, unbidden, and she turned them away from the firelight, not to hide weakness, but to hide the sudden, overwhelming tenderness that threatened to undo her composure. I do not know if I can forgive this, she admitted softly, her voice nearly drowned by the roar of the storm beyond the windows. Not yet. But I understand now that your suffering was never as it seemed, that it was something far subtler and far deeper. Perhaps my heart must catch up to my mind before I can claim any right to it. He nodded, as if he had anticipated her words. Then take the time you must. I am not asking for forgiveness, only for understanding. And perhaps, in time, for the chance to walk not beside pity, but beside love, if you will permit it. His gaze, unwavering, sought hers with a vulnerability she had never witnessed in a man of such title and station. It was a moment stripped of pretense, stripped of expectation, a moment that demanded honesty, courage, and the willingness to see one another in the naked light of truth. The rain intensified, hammering against the leaded panes with relentless insistence, and in that rhythm, they found a tenuous accord. Words became unnecessary. The silence between them carried the weight of shared revelation, of hearts cautiously aligning after the storm of deception had passed. She felt the first stirrings of something neither pity nor propriety could summon, a recognition that love, when built on understanding rather than illusion, could be more powerful than any social expectation or whispered gossip. Yet even as she allowed herself this fragile hope, a shadow of doubt lingered. What of the world outside these walls, with its eyes trained on scandal and its tongues sharpened with mockery? Could the love they had glimpsed in the storm endure when faced with the judgment of society, which would never forgive deceit, however noble the intent? The question remained unspoken, yet it clung to them with the tenacity of ivy on stone. And as the storm began to abate, leaving only the echo of distant thunder, Eliza felt the first real understanding of the man she had married, not broken, not diminished, but whole, yet carrying the scars of isolation and mistrust, waiting for someone brave enough to see past appearances to the heart within. Her hand remained in his, a tentative promise, a bridge between the world she had known and the unknown that now beckoned. Outside, the night had fallen fully, dark and infinite, and the house seemed suspended in the hush that follows revelation. Neither spoke, yet both understood that the truth, once spoken, had irrevocably altered the landscape of their lives. The next step, the next movement in this delicate dance of hearts, would demand courage greater than any act of kindness alone. And in the quiet of the manor, with rain-soaked leaves pressed against the glass like silent witnesses, Eliza sensed the shadow of the secret that remained, the untested depth of the Duke's heart, and whether her own could withstand the revelations yet to come. The letter arrived at Ravenshire Manor just as the dawn was swallowed by a sky heavy with ash and rain, its edges darkened by the careless hands of a messenger whose expression had betrayed both curiosity and judgment. It bore news that had the potential to undo all that Eliza had begun to believe, each word pressing down on her chest like the weight of London itself. The Duke had been observed in the city the previous evening, moving without his cane through the streets with a vigor that contradicted every rumor whispered in parlors and salons. The Ton was already aflame with speculation. The man they had pitied and mocked was not broken at all. Mothers clutched daughters tighter, and men who had whispered jokes behind gilded fans now gawked with embarrassment. The scandal had begun before the day had fully dawned, and Ravenshire Manor felt suddenly like a citadel under siege. Eliza held the letter tremblingly, the candlelight catching in her eyes as if mocking the storm she felt within. The words of her own conscience mingled with the murmurs of society. Did you marry deceit itself, or the man beneath? Have you been a fool in offering kindness where manipulation might have lain? She looked up to find the Duke standing at the window, the storm of his gaze matching the storm outside. Rain slid down the panes in uneven streaks, but he seemed untouched by the chill, as if the elements were subordinate to the gravity of this moment. Have you heard? She asked softly, her voice both accusation and inquiry. The city speaks, and it does so without restraint. The Duke is said to walk unassisted, to mock the pity of those who once applauded it. The whispers, they are relentless. He turned, a slow, deliberate motion, and she saw his face not as she had before, constrained by sorrow and caution, but as one illuminated by the quiet triumph of truth revealed. Let them whisper, he said, voice low and unwavering, for their words are powerless against what has already been established between us. They may know the facade, but they do not know the heart. And it is the heart that matters, Eliza, not the cunning of gossip nor the appetite for scandal. Her gaze faltered, a flutter of conflict and admiration stirring within her. She had expected indignation, perhaps a show of regret, yet here was a man standing tall, unashamed, claiming both responsibility and dignity. It was a revelation of character she had not anticipated, and for the first time, she realized that the man she had married was not merely unbroken in body, but unyielding in spirit. Yet the world outside their walls would not so easily forgive, society's judgment was relentless, and Eliza knew she would be tested as much by their whispers as by her own heart. The first visitors arrived that morning, not with congratulations, but with eyes sharp as steel and tongues sharper still. Aunts and cousins, neighbors and acquaintances, each sought confirmation of the rumor, each eager to witness her reaction, to see whether the gentle lady who had married the Duke out of compassion would crumble under the revelation of his truth. They came with questions laced in malice, with smiles that threatened to slice through propriety, and yet Eliza faced them with a steadiness that surprised even herself. She offered measured responses, her voice clear, her eyes holding the unwavering dignity she had cultivated since the day she first danced with him. The man you see is the man I married, she said, and all the rest is irrelevant. By noon, the scandal had reached the very halls of the Ton, carried by carriage and foot, whispered in salons and servant quarters alike. London's society debated, dissected, and mocked, yet Ravenshire Manor remained a sanctuary, a space in which the Duke and Eliza could navigate the tremors of judgment together. He did not retreat, nor did he retreat from the truth. Instead, he allowed her to stand beside him, a visible testament to courage and loyalty. The world may choose to misunderstand us, he murmured as they walked through the library, its books heavy with knowledge and unspoken stories, but it is not the world that defines the measure of our hearts. Her hand found his, and in that simple touch lay both defiance and agreement. She understood, in a way she could scarcely articulate, that their bond had transcended mere pity. It was a union forged not in convenience, not in the shallow admiration of society, but in the recognition of character, the bravery to see and to accept another fully, without pretense or reservation. Even as the rain battered the windows and the shadows lengthened, they moved through the house with an intimacy that no scandal could diminish, each glance and gesture a quiet assertion of truth and trust. Yet society's assault was relentless, and by evening the Duke determined that a statement must be made, a public acknowledgment that would challenge gossip and restore dignity. A gathering was called, not to celebrate, but to confront, and Eliza accompanied him with a mixture of trepidation and pride. The ballroom, once filled with gentle music and polite chatter, now buzzed with tension. Mirrors reflected the candlelight, capturing the anxious faces of those eager to witness humiliation, while the Duke stood at the center, cane forgotten, bearing the full weight of revelation. When he spoke, it was not with apology, nor with the defensive edge of anger, but with the calm authority of one who had nothing to hide. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice resonant and measured, "it has come to my attention that certain assumptions have been made regarding my condition and my character. Let it be known that I am neither broken nor diminished. Yet I stand before you not to boast of strength, but to declare the value of the heart over rumor, of sincerity over pretense. And more importantly, to acknowledge the courage and constancy of Lady Eliza, who has stood beside me not for pity, not for station, but for the man I am beneath the facade." A hush fell across the room, heavy with disbelief. Some regarded him with newfound respect, others with reluctant awe, many with silent judgment still. But Eliza, standing at his side, felt a profound shift in the air. The scandal that had threatened to engulf her was reframed, reshaped by courage and honesty, and in that moment, the power of society's judgment began to lose its absolute sway. As the assembly dispersed, the Duke turned to her, eyes softening with a warmth that contrasted with the public display of strength. "You see, my lady," he said quietly, "even in the face of the world's scrutiny, the truth, however delayed, has a way of revealing its own justice. We endure, and in enduring, we define the terms by which our hearts are measured." Eliza felt a surge of emotion, a mingling of pride, relief, and the slow bloom of affection that had begun in the shadows of pity and now flourished in the light of shared understanding. The locket he had given her earlier that season rested against her chest. A quiet talisman of their bond, and she pressed her hand over it instinctively, as if anchoring herself to the courage she now recognized within herself. But as the last guests departed, leaving the manor cloaked once more in the stillness of rain and twilight, a single envelope lay unnoticed on the threshold of the Duke's study. Its seal bore a crest unfamiliar yet commanding, and the weight of expectation pressed upon it as though it carried the judgment of all London. The Duke bent to retrieve it, unaware that within those folded papers lay the next trial, one that could either fortify their fragile triumph or rend the hard-won trust between them. Eliza watched him silently, the flickering firelight catching in her eyes, and felt that familiar stir of anticipation, the prelude to a challenge whose depth she had not yet imagined. The storm outside had passed, but another, more subtle tempest waited within the envelope, and within the walls of Ravenshire Manor, she understood that the courage to endure was only the beginning. The candlelight trembled in Ravenshire Manor as a harsh wind tore across the estate, rattling shutters and sending brittle leaves skittering across the stone floors. That morning, an envelope had arrived, heavier than any letter should be, bearing the unmistakable seal of a rival family long jealous of the Duke's lineage and long eager to see scandal engulf his name. Inside, accusations sprawled across the paper in meticulous handwriting, claiming that the Duke's deception had been deliberate manipulation, that the marriage was a calculated scheme to draw pity and then capitalize on it. The words, venomous yet precise, landed upon Eliza's heart like blows she could not deflect. She had believed courage and truth would shield them, now it seemed the very same truth had made them vulnerable to ruin. The Duke stood in the center of the library, the letter open in his hands, but his expression betrayed none of the outrage she had feared. Instead, there was quiet resolve, a calm tempered by the knowledge that this was yet another test, another gauntlet through which their bond must pass. "Eliza," he said, voice low but unwavering, "this is a moment where the heart is measured not by reaction, but by choice. Shall we allow others to dictate the terms of our lives, or shall we define them ourselves?" His eyes, dark and piercing, met hers with the gravity of a man who had spent years guarding every secret, every vulnerability, and now laid them bare, offering her the authority to stand beside him as equal. Her pulse quickened, a mingling of fear and fierce loyalty, and she stepped forward. "We have endured whispers, ridicule, even pity. Shall we bend now to threats penned by those who seek only to divide us? No. We have each other, and for that alone, the world's judgment holds no power." The firelight flickered across her face, illuminating the steady determination in her eyes. She felt a weight lift from her chest, a liberation born of recognizing that courage, once claimed, must be wielded in defiance of those who would exploit weakness. The ballroom that evening was alive with tension unlike any before. Mirrors reflected chandeliers that blazed like frozen stars, the polished floors catching every flicker of candlelight, yet all eyes were drawn inexorably to the Duke and his bride. Murmurs rippled through the assembly as guests whispered of the scandalous letter, their curiosity sharp as a blade. Mothers clutched daughters, peers leaned forward with excitement, and men who had once mocked the Duke now regarded him with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant admiration. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, and every heartbeat seemed amplified in the charged air. Eliza took his hand, small and firm within her own, and the gesture was a silent declaration that they faced this moment together. The Duke, cane abandoned, stood taller than many expected, every inch a man unbroken, a man who had endured isolation, ridicule, and the judgments of an unforgiving society. He raised his voice, clear and commanding, cutting through the murmur like a blade tempered with warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "it is true that I concealed my recovery from injury, but it was never with malice. It was a test of character, a measure of truth beyond appearances. Those who sought pity found it, but it was not for manipulation that I lived beneath that guise, it was to discover if sincerity, virtue, and courage could survive untainted by the lure of fortune or the seduction of title. Lady Eliza, my wife, proved that love may exist where none is expected, that hearts can see beyond the surface and find what is worthy of devotion." A hush fell upon the assembly, the echoes of judgment stilled by the sheer force of his declaration. Some faces flushed with embarrassment, others softened in quiet admiration, yet all eyes lingered on the pair who had turned scandal into an assertion of truth. Eliza felt a surge of warmth and pride, not merely in herself, but in the man who had trusted her with the entirety of his heart, who had allowed vulnerability to coexist with dignity. She pressed her hand to his, a small act, yet one brimming with shared triumph and unspoken passion. The Duke lowered himself to one knee in the center of the room, a gesture of humility and devotion, his gaze never leaving hers. "I offer not a plea for forgiveness," he murmured, voice steady and resonant, "but a declaration of love that has endured whispers, shadows, and storms alike. Lady Eliza, my heart belongs wholly to you. Will you allow me the honor of your hand, not in duty, not in pity, but in a love that is ours alone?" Tears sprang unbidden to her eyes, and for the first time she understood that pity had transformed into something infinitely richer. She stepped forward, knelt beside him, and placed her hand in his. "Yes," she whispered, voice trembling, "1,000 times yes. Not for what the world demands, but for the man whose soul I have seen and whose heart I honor in return." The room erupted in a mixture of applause and astonished murmurs, yet Eliza felt no fear, no insecurity. The truth of their union had been affirmed not merely to society, but to themselves, and the fragile balance of reputation and rumor no longer held sway over hearts so steadfastly entwined. The locket rested against her chest, the violet inside a small, persistent emblem of the journey that had begun with compassion and now blossomed into love. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the envelope from earlier remained upon the table, its presence a reminder that the world beyond the manor had not fully relinquished its hold. The letter contained threats and insinuations that might yet demand attention, proof that courage and truth, though powerful, did not render one invulnerable. The Duke folded it carefully, his eyes meeting Eliza's with a silent acknowledgement that the story was not yet complete. There were more trials to face, more judgments to endure, and perhaps secrets still hidden, waiting for the right hour to emerge. As the candlelight flickered and the last of the guests departed, the Duke and Eliza remained in the center of the room, hands clasped, hearts steady. Outside, the storm had passed entirely, leaving only a calm punctuated by distant echoes of thunder, a reminder that peace is always accompanied by memory of turmoil. Eliza felt the profound truth of their shared endurance, that love, once tested by deception, scandal, and fear, could emerge stronger, steadier, and more luminous than any expectation or rumor. And yet, as she rested her head against his shoulder, a quiet unease lingered in the periphery, a whisper that the letter, though folded and set aside, was merely the first of unseen challenges, and that the world beyond Ravenshire's walls might yet demand the courage they had so painstakingly claimed. Their hearts were united, yes, but the shadows of judgment and the unpredictable tides of fortune would not entirely fade, leaving the promise that the next chapter of their lives, though bright with love, would be written with vigilance, bravery, and a steadfastness of heart that neither scandal nor time could undermine.